Somewhere beneath the turquoise surface of the Bahamian Sea, beyond the reach of sunlight and the comfort of the shallows, there is a place the water turns black. Not the soft, romantic black of a midnight sky. Something older than that, something colder, a blackness that has no bottom. Or rather, a bottom so far removed from the living world above it that the distinction hardly matters. The locals call these places blue holes, and for centuries they have known, with a certainty that does not require argument, that something lives inside them. They call it the LUSCA. It is not a creature that announces itself. It does not breach the surface in some theatrical display of dominance, the way a whale might, or a great shark hunting in open water. The LUSCA does not need spectacle. It is, by its very nature, a creature of ambush, of patience so ancient it feels geological. It waits in those submerged cathedral caves, in the cold pressure of the deep, and it waits the way stone waits. Unhurried, inevitable. What the LUSCA is precisely depends on who is telling the story, and this, in itself, tells us something important. Legends that carry truth in them rarely arrive with clean edges. The people of the Caribbean, the Bahamian islanders who have fished these waters for generations, describe something that should not exist. A creature of impossible contradiction, half shark, half octopus, though those words feel insufficient, like describing a hurricane as simply wind and rain. The body is vast, tentacled, with arms that reach in every direction like the spokes of some terrible living wheel. But attached to that boneless, grasping mass is something with teeth, something with the cold, forward momentum of a predator that has been perfecting its craft since long before human beings first looked at the ocean and decided, bravely or foolishly, to sail it. By most accounts, the LUSCA is enormous, some stories placing it at 100 feet or more, though the nature of fear and darkness is that it tends to make things larger than they already are. Even at half that size, the creature described is something that renders every other ocean predator a secondary concern. A shark may take you from below, quick and indifferent. The LUSCA takes you completely. The tentacles first, long, muscular, and deceptively fast for something so large. Then the pull, a downward drag into those blue holes with a force that no swimmer, no diver, no struggling human being could resist. The sea itself seems to cooperate. The currents around certain blue holes are known to behave strangely, sudden, powerful suctions that appear without warning, drawing water inward and downward, as though something below is inhaling. Many who study such things believe this is simply the tidal mechanics of the cave systems. The science of it is interesting, but the fishermen of Andros Island, who have watched those waters their entire lives, do not reach for that explanation first. And perhaps they shouldn't, because the disappearances are real. Boats found empty, divers who descended and did not return, swimmers pulled under within sight of shore, the surface going still again with an almost offensive calm. The blue holes of the Bahamas are not casual places. They are some of the deepest underwater cave systems on Earth. Andros Island alone hosts hundreds of them, many still unmapped, still uncharted, their passages threading through the limestone bedrock like the veins of some buried, breathing thing. What lives in those passages, in that absolute pressurized dark, is largely unknown, which means by every reasonable measure, the LUSCA cannot be ruled out. That is the peculiar power of this legend. It does not ask you to believe in magic. It asks you only to accept that the ocean is large, the dark is deep, and that human knowledge has limits which the sea has never particularly respected. The water is calm above the blue hole. It is always calm above the blue hole. Let us begin. There is a moment when you are flying over the Bahamas that the sea does something unexpected. You are looking down at water the color of shallow dreams. That particular Caribbean turquoise that painters have been attempting and failing to replicate for centuries. And then, without warning, the color simply stops. A circle of pure, depthless blue opens in the sea floor below you, so dark it appears almost violet from altitude, so perfectly defined against the surrounding shallows that it looks less like a natural formation and more like something was pressed into the earth from above. A thumbprint left by something unimaginably large. These are the blue holes. And from the air, the first thing you feel is not fear. It is wonder. The fear comes later. To understand the LUSCA, to truly understand it, rather than merely cataloguing it as folklore, you must first understand the world it is said to inhabit, because the creature and its domain are inseparable. The LUSCA is not simply a monster that happens to live in an interesting place. It is, in a very real sense, a product of these places, born of them, shaped by them. The blue holes of the Bahamas are so extraordinary, so legitimately strange, that they do not need embellishment to inspire awe. They do not need a creature lurking within them to be remarkable. And yet, when you learn what they actually are, what they contain, how they behave, what science has found in their depths, the idea of the LUSCA stops feeling like invention and starts feeling like a reasonable conclusion. The blue holes of the Bahamas number in the hundreds. Andros Island alone, the largest landmass in the Bahamian archipelago, is home to more blue holes than any comparable region on Earth. They come in two varieties, and the distinction matters. Inland blue holes punctuate the limestone interior of the islands, sitting quietly in the landscape like still, dark mirrors surrounded by pine forest and scrub. Ocean blue holes open in the sea floor of the surrounding banks and channels, their entrances accessible to anything, or anyone, moving through the water above them. Both types share the same origin story, and it is one that begins not with water, but with ice. 20,000 years ago, during the last great ice age, the sea level in this part of the world was dramatically lower than it is today. By some estimates, more than 300 feet lower. What is now the shallow Bahamian seafloor was then exposed. Land, a vast limestone plateau, dry and open to the sky. And limestone, given enough time and enough rainfall, does something remarkable. It dissolves. Rainwater, made mildly acidic by the carbon dioxide it absorbs from the air, eats slowly and patiently through limestone over thousands of years, carving tunnels and chambers and passages through the rock. Cave systems form, caverns open. The ground becomes, in places, more hollow than solid, a labyrinth of subterranean space hidden beneath an ordinary-looking surface. Then the ice age ended. The glaciers retreated. The sea level rose, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, until the water reclaimed the plateau entirely. It flooded those cave systems. It drowned those chambers. And in places where the cave roofs had already collapsed, or where erosion had opened the surface from below, the sea poured in and created something new. Those perfectly circular, perfectly vertical shafts, dropping from the sea floor into the darkness of the ancient cave network below. What you see when you look into a blue hole, then, is not merely a hole in the ocean floor. You are looking into the skeleton of a vanished landscape, a memory of a world that existed before the sea returned to claim it. And the sea has not fully explored what it reclaimed. The cave systems connected to the ocean blue holes of the Bahamas extend for distances that remain, to this day, only partially charted. Some passages have been followed for thousands of feet before divers, limited by the physics of breathing and the pragmatics of survival, have been forced to turn back with the tunnels still continuing ahead of them. The walls of these passages are lined with stalactites and stalagmites, formations that can only grow in open air, which means they grew during those ice age centuries when the caves were dry. Finding them submerged is like finding a cathedral underwater. It is beautiful in the specific way that displaced things are beautiful. Things that exist in a context their origins never anticipated. The water within the blue holes is stratified in layers, and this is where the science becomes genuinely startling. Near the surface, fresh water seeps down through the limestone from the island above, creating a lens of relatively fresh, oxygenated water. Below that, at varying depths, depending on the location, the fresh water meets the intruding salt water from the ocean, and the two do not mix easily. They sit on top of one another, separated by a boundary called the halocline, a shimmering visual distortion where light bends differently through waters of different salinity, creating an effect that divers describe as looking through frosted glass, or through a lens that seems to make the cave floor below simultaneously closer and further than it actually is. Below the halocline, the water is salt water, and below a certain depth, it becomes something more specific and more sinister. It becomes anoxic, devoid of oxygen, a chemical environment so hostile to conventional aerobic life that most creatures cannot survive in it. Most creatures, what does survive in the anoxic zones of the Bahamian blue holes, has astonished researchers who have managed to sample from those depths. Microbial mats of extraordinary antiquity, hydrogen sulfide clouds that hang in the water like slow, poisonous weather, preserved organic material, wood, leaves, the remains of organisms that would have decayed within weeks in a normal marine environment, but has instead been mummified in this strange, airless deep. Blue holes have yielded the bones of extinct animals, tortoises, crocodiles, birds, species that walked the dry plateau before the sea reclaimed it. They have yielded human remains as well, ancient remains, deposited by pre-Columbian peoples who appear to have used certain blue holes as places of ritual significance, sacred spaces, thresholds. Doors, perhaps, is not such an unreasonable word for them. But here is what matters most for the purposes of the LUSCA, and it is a thing that the science does not dismiss easily. The tidal mechanics of the ocean blue holes create a phenomenon that every islander who has spent time near them can describe in identical terms, regardless of whether they have ever heard of the LUSCA at all. At certain points in the tidal cycle, the blue holes breathe. As the tide rises, water is forced into the cave systems through every available passage, and the blue hole exhales, pushing water outward and upward through its surface entrance in a visible, sometimes powerful current. As the tide falls, that same water is drawn back in, and the blue hole inhales, creating a suction at its mouth that pulls inward with a force proportional to the volume of the cave network below. In the larger systems, this inhalation is not subtle. It is a genuine, measurable current. Objects floating near the entrance of a tidal blue hole at the wrong moment in the cycle will be drawn toward it, pulled. The islanders of Andros have known this for as long as anyone can remember. They give the blue holes space. They teach their children to give them space, not because of myth and not because of superstition, but because the blue holes have taken people. Divers have been swept into passages and pinned there by the inflowing current until their air ran out. Swimmers have been pulled under in calm, apparently safe water. The sea, in these places, has appetites. The LUSCA, in this light, is not a monster invented to frighten children. It is something more sophisticated than that. It is an explanation, a way of giving shape and agency to a danger that is real, that is recurring, and that the ocean offers no apology for. When a culture watches the sea swallow its people, it reaches quite naturally for a creature that swallows. When the water pulls without warning, you imagine something below that is pulling. You imagine something enormous and patient and perfectly adapted to the dark. You imagine, in other words, the LUSCA. And when you understand what the blue holes actually are, these ancient, stratified, incompletely mapped, breathing shafts into the hollow bones of a drowned world, The imagining does not feel nearly as unreasonable as it might have before you came to know them. The doors are real. What lies beyond them is another question entirely. The origins, where the legend was born. Every legend has a birthplace, not a date, not a single author, not a moment you could point to on a calendar and say, there, that is when it began. Legends do not work that way. They accumulate. They are built slowly, the way coral reefs are built, layer by layer, organism by organism, each generation adding its own small deposit to the structure, until what exists is something vast and complex and alive in a way that no single contributor could have achieved alone. The LUSCA is no different. To find its origins, you do not look for one story. You look for a confluence, a place where geography, history, culture, and the particular psychology of people living very close to a very dangerous sea all converge. And from that convergence, you watch a creature emerge. That place is the Caribbean, and its story is considerably older than most people realize. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon of the Bahamian Sea, the islands of the Caribbean were home to a people whose relationship with the ocean was intimate, intricate, and entirely without the safety nets that modern seafaring provides. The Lucayan Taino were the indigenous inhabitants of the Bahamas, a branch of the broader Arawakan-speaking peoples who had, over centuries of extraordinary open-water navigation, spread across the Caribbean island chain from their origins in South America. They were not casual beachgoers. They were people of the sea in the deepest sense. Fishermen, traders, navigators who read the ocean the way others read landscape, who understood the moods of the water with a fluency that comes only from absolute dependence, and they knew about the blue holes. The Taino had a cosmological framework in which the natural world and the spiritual world were not separate territories. They were the same territory, experienced at different depths. Caves, in particular, held enormous spiritual significance. They were understood as places of transition, thresholds between the living world and the world of the ancestors, between the surface and whatever lay beneath it. The Taino creation mythology describes humanity itself as having emerged from caves. The cave was not a void, it was a source, a womb, a place of power that demanded respect precisely because of what it contained. It is not difficult to see how the blue holes, those sudden, dark, impossibly deep openings in the seafloor, breathing with the tides, pulling and exhaling with a regularity that felt almost biological, would have fit directly into this cosmological understanding. These were not simply geological features to the Taino. They were sacred spaces, charged places. The bones of researchers who have explored the deeper and more inaccessible blue holes suggest deliberate ritual deposition, objects and remains placed there intentionally, offerings made to whatever power the water concealed. The threshold was being honored. Something on the other side was being acknowledged. What that something was, the archaeological record does not tell us with precision, but the practice of acknowledging it tells us everything about the emotional and spiritual weight these places carry long before the word LUSCA was ever spoken aloud. Then the world changed. The arrival of European colonizers in the Caribbean beginning in the late 15th century initiated one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in recorded human history. The Lucayan Taino of the Bahamas, exposed to diseases against which they had no immunity and subjected to forced labor and displacement, were effectively gone as a distinct population within decades of first contact. Their specific stories, their precise vocabulary for the things they feared and honored in the water, went with them, not entirely, but enough that what remains is fragmentary, filtered through the accounts of outsiders who were not always paying close attention to the right things. What did not go was the land, the water, the blue holes. Those remained exactly as they had always been, patient and indifferent to the human drama unfolding on the surface above them. And into the space left by one culture came others, The African diaspora brought to the Caribbean through the brutal machinery of the transatlantic slave trade carried with it an extraordinarily rich tradition of oral mythology, stories of sea creatures, of shapeshifters, of entities that occupied the boundary between water and something else. West African and Central African spiritual traditions, particularly those of the Yoruba, the Fon, the Bakongo and others, were filled with water spirits of complex and often dangerous character. These were not simple monsters. They were entities of moral ambiguity, powerful, capricious, capable of benevolence and destruction in equal measure, worthy of respect rather than simply fear. The Mami Wata tradition, the water spirits of the Dahomey and Vodun, the river and sea deities of the Yoruba pantheon, all of these carried into the Caribbean a framework in which the water was understood as inhabited by intelligence, by agency, by something that could choose. In the Bahamas, this African spiritual vocabulary met the geography of the blue holes, and it met the fragmented residue of Taino cosmology that still persisted in the landscape and the folk memory of the islands. The result was a creature that bore the fingerprints of multiple traditions without belonging entirely to any single one, something with tentacles, that particular physical form recurring across multiple West African sea creature traditions, something that pulled downward, that occupied the deep, that could not be fully seen or fully known, something that chose its victims with an intention that mere geology could not account for. The LUSCA, in this sense, was not invented. It was synthesized. It arose from the meeting of cultures in a landscape that demanded explanation, and the explanation it offered drew from every available source of wisdom about dangerous water and the things that inhabit it. The name itself is worth examining. LUSCA. And here the etymology becomes pleasingly murky, as the etymologies of folk creatures often do. Some researchers have proposed a connection to the Spanish pulpo or related Romance language words for octopus or large sea creature, filtered through the particular phonological transformations that language undergoes when it moves through generations and across cultural boundaries. Others suggest African linguistic roots, pointing to similar-sounding words in several West African languages that carry connotations of grasping, pulling, or consuming. Still others note the similarity to the name of the Lucayan people themselves. The Lucayans, the Lucayas, the Lucayas, the LUSCA, and suggest that the creature's name may be a kind of geographical echo, the sea monster of a people whose name has itself become part of the landscape. None of these explanations is mutually exclusive. In a region defined by the collision and mixture of languages, Taino, Spanish, English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and dozens of African languages all pressing against one another in the confined space of the island chain. The surprise would be if a word like LUSCA had a single, clean origin. It almost certainly does not. It is, like the creature itself, a mixture, a confluence. What is consistent across all the traditions that feed into the LUSCA is the specific combination of characteristics that make it so distinctly terrifying. And it is worth dwelling on this combination, because it is not arbitrary. Each element serves a specific narrative and psychological function. The octopus component, the tentacles, the grasping arms, the ability to reach in multiple directions simultaneously, speaks to a fear that is older than any specific culture, the fear of being seized, of being held. There is something about the mechanics of an octopus's grip that bypasses the rational mind entirely and speaks directly to something more primitive. A shark bite is terrible, but it is a single, directed attack. Tentacles surround. They do not leave a single point of resistance. They find every angle. The LUSCA, in its octopus aspect, does not give its victims a direction to fight in. It simply closes. The shark component adds speed and teeth to what would otherwise be a slow, strangling threat. The shark, in Caribbean maritime culture was already a creature of particular dread, not merely because of its physical danger, but because of its association with death at sea, the fate of those lost overboard during the Middle Passage, a trauma so profound and so widespread in the African Caribbean community that the shark had become freighted with an almost supernatural weight. To combine the shark with the octopus was to take two already charged fears and fuse them into something that exceeded either source. The LUSCA is not more frightening than a shark and an octopus separately. It is more frightening than both of them combined could be, because the combination produces something that has no weakness. The shark is fast but cannot hold. The octopus can hold but must wait. The LUSCA does not have to choose. And then there is the environment, the blue hole. This, ultimately, is the most important element of the LUSCA's origin, not what the creature is, but where it lives. Because the blue hole resolves every logistical problem that a creature of this size and power would otherwise present. Why has no one seen it clearly? Because it lives in the dark. Why has no body ever been recovered? Because the cave systems are effectively infinite in their complexity, and what goes down does not come back up. Why does it strike without warning? Because the blue hole's tidal mechanics provide the perfect cover. The suction that takes a swimmer could be current, could be geology, could be the sea simply being the sea. Only the people who live beside it, who have watched it for generations, know to read the suction as something more intentional than that. The blue hole gives the LUSCA deniability, and deniability, for a sea monster, is the most terrifying feature of all. There is one more thread to pull in tracing these origins, and it is one that connects the Bahamas to a much wider web of oceanic mythology, because the LUSCA, for all its Caribbean specificity, is not alone in what it represents. The ancient Greeks placed the Scylla in a narrow strait, a multi-headed, tentacled creature that reached from caves in the cliffs to drag sailors from their ships. The Norse kraken slept on the ocean floor and rose to engulf entire vessels, creating whirlpools with its descent. The coastal Algonquian peoples of North America spoke of the Mishipeshu, a horned, serpentine water creature that lived in the deepest lakes and pulled the unwary beneath the surface. The Maori of New Zealand described the Taniwha, great water creatures occupying dangerous river passages and coastal waters, sometimes protective, sometimes predatory, always powerful, across cultures that never contacted one another, across oceans and centuries and entirely separate intellectual traditions. Humanity keeps arriving at the same creature. Something enormous, something that lives in deep water, something that pulls from below. The LUSCA did not emerge from isolation. It emerged from a universal human reckoning with the ocean's depth. The recognition, felt independently by every seafaring culture, that the water is not empty, that the dark is not simply the absence of light, that something in the deep has weight and will and appetite, and that the surface we sail upon is the thinnest possible membrane between us. And whatever that something is, the Caribbean gave that universal recognition a specific shape, a specific home, a specific name, and the blue holes of the Bahamas gave it somewhere to live. The sightings, what people have seen. There is a particular kind of testimony that is difficult to dismiss, not the testimony of the excitable or the credulous, or the person who read something once and has been looking for confirmation ever since. That kind of testimony is easy to set aside, and sets itself aside, often, by the very enthusiasm with which it is offered. No, the testimony that stays with you, that lodges itself somewhere behind rational thought and refuses to fully dissolve, is the testimony of the reluctant witness, the fisherman who does not want to tell you what he saw, the diver who will describe the incident precisely once in a flat, careful voice and then change the subject, the woman whose family has fished these waters for 4 generations, who has no interest in tourists or television crews or being made into a story, who tells you simply and without embellishment what happened the morning her husband's boat came back without him and what the water looked like when it did. The Bahamas and the broader Caribbean have produced a great many reluctant witnesses. Their accounts do not agree on every detail. They never do. And accounts that agree on every detail are, in fact, more suspicious than those that differ. But they converge on certain elements with a consistency that the serious researcher does not simply wave away. Something large, something below the surface, and a pull that had no innocent explanation. The island of Andros generates the highest concentration of reported encounters, which is entirely consistent with its status as the blue hole capital of the known world. But before examining specific accounts, it is worth establishing the baseline, the ordinary, accepted, non-legendary reality of Andros that provides the backdrop against which these reports must be understood. Andros Island is not a busy place. It is the largest island in the Bahamas, and among the least populated, a ratio that produces a particular kind of quietness. The quietness of a place that has not been fully tamed, where the interior pine barrens and mangrove wetlands still feel genuinely wild, and where the sea around it does not feel like the managed, recreational sea of the resort islands to the northeast. The fishing communities along the Andros coastline are small and close-knit, sustained by generations of accumulated local knowledge about these specific waters. These are not people inclined to romantic invention. The sea, for them, is not a backdrop. It is an employer, a provider, and an occasional executioner, and they regard it with the unsentimental pragmatism that long familiarity with dangerous work produces. When these people describe something unusual in the water, the unusual thing is that they describe it at all. Among the most frequently referenced categories of reported encounters are what local fishermen describe simply as the pull, a sudden, powerful suction experienced in open water, away from any known blue hole entrance, with no corresponding tidal event or current pattern to account for it. These reports come from experienced boatmen who know these waters intimately, who have felt every ordinary variation of current and tidal flow across decades of working on the same stretches of sea. The pull they describe is categorically different. It is directional, always downward, never lateral. It is brief, lasting seconds, not minutes. And it is, in almost every account, accompanied by a disturbance of the water surface that the witnesses struggle to find adequate language for. Not a wave exactly, not a whirlpool in the classical sense. A depression, as though the surface of the sea briefly acquiesced to pressure from below, yielding downward in a way that water exposed to sky simply should not do. Several of these accounts include the observation of color change in the water directly above the disturbance, a darkening, a sudden appearance of deep blue or near black water in a location that had previously shown the pale turquoise of the shallows. This is consistent with what happens when cold, deep water is displaced upward rapidly. The thermocline disrupts, and the visual properties of the water change measurably. It is a phenomenon with several mundane explanations, but in the context described, where no submarine geography would produce such an upwelling, and where the disturbance is localized and brief rather than diffuse and sustained, those mundane explanations become strained. The fishermen do not offer alternative explanations. They pull their nets in, they note the location quietly among themselves, and they do not return to that spot. This is, in its way, a form of data. People who make their living from specific patches of water do not voluntarily abandon productive locations without compelling reason. The diving community has contributed its own category of testimony, and this is where the accounts become both more detailed and more troubling, because divers bring to their observations the discipline of people trained to record precise information in challenging conditions: depth, visibility, temperature, time. These things are not guessed at, they are measured, or as closely approximated as the environment allows. A cluster of reports from cave divers exploring the inland blue holes of Andros during the latter decades of the 20th century describes a specific and recurring experience that the divers themselves found difficult to categorize. While navigating the horizontal passages of the cave systems, at depths where the halocline had already been crossed and the water had taken on the particular still quality of the anoxic zone's upper boundary, several independent dive teams reported observing what they initially interpreted as a large shadow moving in the water ahead of them, in the direction deeper into the cave system, away from the entrance. The instinct in such situations is to assume a trick of the light or the movement of one's own dive light, casting unexpected shadows through the refracting layers of the halocline. Experienced cave divers know these optical phenomena well. What made these particular observations notable is that they persisted past the moment when light-based explanations had been exhausted, when the divers had repositioned themselves, reoriented their lights, and still observed motion in water that should, by every measurement, have been motionless. One account, offered by a British cave diving expedition member who explored the Andros system in the early 1990s, describes what he initially took to be a collapse of the cave wall at the far extent of his visibility, a darkening across the full width of the passage, roughly 15 to 20 feet across, that appeared and then was gone before he could resolve it into anything specific. He noted it in his dive log as possible. Large marine animal, unidentified, deep passage, Andros blue hole system, and declined, when later interviewed for a Caribbean marine biology survey, to speculate beyond that notation. He was, by his own description, an empiricist. He recorded what he observed. He did not record what he believed. That restraint is instructive. The surface accounts, those involving the open ocean rather than the cave systems, carry a different character and tend to cluster around the phenomenon that Bahamian maritime culture has long referred to as the sea opening. This is the local term for what appears to be a sudden transient vortex or depression in otherwise calm water, occurring without apparent meteorological cause and disappearing within moments of its appearance. Sailors and fishermen in the Bahamas have described the sea opening for as long as records of their testimony exist. In the pre-LUSCA framework, the sea opening was itself the feared thing, not a symptom of a creature below, but the manifestation of the blue hole's tidal breathing at an ocean surface expression point, where the cave system's ventilation reaches the surface in a location separate from its primary entrance. What several 20th century accounts added to this established phenomenon was the observation of something breaking the surface at or near the center of the opening, not breaching as a whale breaches, not the sharp cut of a fin, something that several witnesses described with the same approximate language, independently and across years, a spreading or an unfolding, a darkness at the center of the water depression that appeared to have structure, that appeared, in other words, to be an object rather than a shadow, and an object with dimensions that the observers found difficult to estimate, but were consistent in describing as large, very large. These accounts are the most contested, and understandably so. Surface observations in disturbed water are notoriously unreliable. The human visual system, confronted with the combination of water movement, reflected sky, and sudden unexpected stimuli, has a well-documented tendency to impose pattern and scale in ways that objective measurement would not support. This is not a character flaw in the observers. It is a feature of perception that affects everyone, and it must be weighed when evaluating surface testimony. What makes these particular accounts resist easy dismissal is not their drama, but their restraint. The witnesses who prove most compelling are those who describe what they saw in minimal terms, who reach only for the details they are certain of, and who uniformly decline to confirm that what they saw was the LUSCA specifically. Only that it was something they could not account for, something the water produced without warning, and reclaimed before a conclusion could be drawn. There is one incident that sits apart from all the others, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most documented. In the late 1960s, a small research vessel operating in the waters around Andros as part of a preliminary survey of the blue hole systems reported an incident that found its way into the survey's ancillary notes, a section dedicated, in the dry language of field documentation, to anomalous observations not attributable to known marine phenomena. The vessel had anchored near the mouth of an ocean blue hole to take measurements. The water was calm. Visibility was good. Two crew members observing the blue hole mouth from the deck reported that the water in and immediately around the entrance had changed character abruptly, darkening, disturbing, producing a surface expression inconsistent with the tidal phase at that time. Simultaneously, the vessel's anchor line, which had been hanging vertically in still water, pulled taut in a direction consistent with a strong lateral current at depth, a current that the instruments aboard recorded no evidence of. The observation lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then the water calmed. The anchor line went slack. The instruments returned to their previous readings. The researchers noted it. They did not explain it. They moved their anchorage point to a different location and continued their work. When asked about the incident years later, the survey's lead researcher, a marine geologist with no particular interest in folklore, said something that has been quoted, in various forms, in almost every serious treatment of the LUSCA since, that the ocean, in his experience, occasionally did things for which the available science was genuinely insufficient as an explanation, and that intellectual honesty required acknowledging those moments rather than retrofitting a comfortable theory onto them. He did not say the LUSCA was real, but he did not say it was not. That, in the end, is the honest position that the sightings place us in, not certainty in either direction, not the clean resolution that reason prefers, only the accumulation of careful, reluctant, independently consistent testimony from people who had no particular interest in being believed, pointing towards something in the water that the water has not yet seen fit to fully reveal. The blue holes keep their secrets the way they keep everything else, completely, and in the dark. The science, what has been found, and what has not science, at its best, is not a destroyer of wonder. This is a misunderstanding that has persisted for a long time. The idea that the scientific method exists to reduce, to explain away, to replace the luminous uncertainty of mystery with the flat fluorescence of fact, that every question answered is a small death, that to know a thing is to lose it. The blue holes of the Bahamas have done more to challenge this misunderstanding than almost any environment on Earth, because what science has found in them, what researchers, biologists, geologists, paleontologists, and cave divers have collectively pulled from their depths over the past half-century of serious investigation, is not a smaller world than the one the legends described. It is a larger one, stranger, more ancient, more biologically improbable, more genuinely astonishing than the LUSCA itself, in certain respects. If the LUSCA is taken merely as a large animal that grasps and pulls and lives in the dark, the science does not disprove the LUSCA. It does something more interesting than that. It explains why the LUSCA is the kind of idea that a place like this would inevitably produce, and it leaves, with careful and deliberate honesty, a set of doors that it has not yet been able to open. Systematic scientific exploration of the Bahamian blue holes began in earnest in the 1970s, driven initially by cave divers rather than academic institutions, a pattern common to many extreme environments where the people with the physical skills to access a place arrive before the people with the institutional funding to study it. The pioneering work of cave diving explorers like George Benjamin, who surveyed the Andros blue holes extensively in the late 1960s and early 1970s, produced the first detailed maps of the cave system interiors and the first reliable measurements of what the water inside those systems actually contained. What Benjamin and his contemporaries discovered in the chemistry of the blue holes was immediately arresting. The stratification of the water column. Fresh above, salt below, with the halocline boundary between them, created not merely different salinity levels, but effectively different worlds, chemically separated and biologically distinct. The upper freshwater lens supported modest communities of organisms adapted to low salinity, relatively oxygenated conditions. Below the halocline, the saltwater zone hosted different organisms entirely, adapted to the reversed conditions of higher salinity and producing oxygen. And below that, in the deepest accessible regions of the cave systems, the water became anoxic, chemically reducing, thick with hydrogen sulfide, hostile to virtually every form of complex life that breathes oxygen in any form. Virtually every form, not every form. The microbial communities discovered in the anoxic zones of the Bahamian blue holes represent some of the most scientifically significant biological finds of the late 20th century. These are organisms that do not breathe oxygen. They metabolize sulfur compounds, deriving energy from chemical reactions that require none of the conditions that surface life depends upon. They are, in the precise technical sense, extremophiles, life forms that thrive in conditions defined by their hostility to conventional biology. Their existence in the blue holes is not merely interesting as a local curiosity. It is relevant to the broader scientific understanding of where life can exist, under what conditions, and how far the definition of a habitable environment can be stretched before it breaks. It is not broken yet. The paleontological finds from the blue holes constitute a separate chapter of astonishment, and one that bears directly on the question of what the deep cave systems might conceal. The anoxic conditions that make the deepest zones uninhabitable for complex aerobic life have a compensating property. They preserve organic material with extraordinary fidelity. In the absence of the oxygen-dependent bacteria that drive decomposition in normal environments, organic matter does not rot. It simply remains. Researchers extracting sediment cores and conducting careful dives into accessible anoxic zones have recovered material of remarkable antiquity and variety. The bones of the Bahamian hutia, a large rodent, now extinct, in quantities and states of preservation that have provided invaluable data about its biology and extinction timeline. The remains of tortoises larger than any species currently living in the Caribbean, preserved in sufficient detail to allow precise morphological analysis. Crocodilian remains from species that no longer exist. Plant material, seeds, wood fragments, leaves, dating back thousands of years and still identifiable to species level. Their cellular structures intact in a way that no surface deposit of equivalent age could match. And, recovered from several sites across the Andros system, human remains. Ancient remains, predating European contact, deposited in locations that suggest intention rather than accident. The blue holes as burial sites, or offering sites, or both, consistent with the Taino cosmological understanding of caves as sacred thresholds, physical spaces where the membrane between the living world and something else was thin enough to be addressed. The presence of so much preserved biological material in the blue holes raises a question that the researchers themselves have noted with varying degrees of directness. If the anoxic preservation conditions are this effective, and if the cave systems extend far beyond the distances that have been explored, what else might be down there? What organic material? What biological record? What evidence of what has lived in or passed through these systems might exist in the unexplored passages? Not as living organisms. The anoxic deep is not a habitat for complex aerobic life, but as a record, a repository, a cold, dark, perfectly preserving archive of everything that the blue holes have taken over the centuries. The archive has not been fully read, not remotely. The question of what living organisms currently inhabit the accessible, oxygenated zones of the blue hole systems has been addressed with increasing sophistication as diving technology and biological sampling methods have improved. The results are characteristically more surprising than expected. The cave systems support communities of stygobitic organisms, creatures that have adapted over geological time to permanent cave existence and are now entirely dependent on it, unable to survive in surface conditions. Blind shrimp. Eyeless crustaceans of several species, some found nowhere else on Earth. Specialized fish, pale and sightless, moving through the cave passages with a sensory apparatus tuned entirely to pressure and vibration rather than light. These are not creatures that wandered into the caves and found them acceptable. They are creatures that the caves have been slowly, patiently reshaping over thousands of generations. Creatures that the dark has been building in its own image. Their existence confirms what the cave system's sheer extent implies, that there is a functioning, complex, self-sustaining ecosystem operating in the blue holes, entirely independent of the surface world above it. An ecosystem with its own food chains, its own energy pathways, its own evolutionary pressures. The biological communities discovered in the accessible regions of the system are already surprising in their diversity. What exists in the regions that have not yet been accessed remains, by definition, unknown. It is here that the scientific conversation about the LUSCA becomes genuinely interesting. Not as a question of whether a half-shark, half-octopus creature exists in the literal folkloric form described, but as a question of biological possibility. The blue hole systems of the Bahamas are hydraulically connected to the open ocean. The cave passages, though narrow in many sections, open into larger chambers at irregular intervals, and the tidal connection to the sea means that marine organisms can, in principle, enter the system from the ocean side. What organisms have done so, how large they are, how deeply they penetrate the system, and how they navigate the transition between the open saltwater ocean and the chemically stratified cave environment. These are questions that remain only partially answered. Large cephalopods, members of the octopus and squid family, are known to inhabit deep ocean environments and are capable of navigating complex three-dimensional spaces with remarkable facility. The giant Pacific octopus, the largest confirmed octopus species, regularly reaches arm spans of 14 feet and has demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that place it among the most cognitively sophisticated invertebrates known to science. Larger, unconfirmed cephalopod species are not a fringe hypothesis. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, was itself considered a sailor's legend, a piece of maritime folklore too extreme to be credible, until specimens began washing ashore in sufficient numbers that the scientific community could no longer maintain skepticism. The colossal squid, even larger, followed a similar trajectory from legend to confirmed biology. The ocean's track record on this particular question, the question of whether something believed to be impossibly large actually exists, is not a record that argues for confident dismissal. In 2021, a scientific survey of the blue holes of the Bahamas produced what was, in media terms, a headline about bacteria and prehistoric finds, but what was, in scientific terms, a document of considerable significance. The survey, conducted by a team from multiple institutions including Florida State University, produced detailed chemical and biological profiles of several Andros blue holes, and in doing so, confirmed what earlier researchers had suspected, that the biological complexity of these systems exceeds what their relatively modest geographic footprint would suggest. The caves are, in biological terms, punching significantly above their weight. The diversity of microbial life alone represents years of future study. The survey also confirmed, with updated precision, what cave divers had long reported anecdotally, that portions of the mapped cave systems remain in conditions that prevent further penetration by current diving technology. passages that narrow below the minimum dimensions for a diver in equipment, sections where hydrogen sulfide concentrations reach levels that compromise dive instrumentation, chambers where the floor sediment is so fine and so easily disturbed that visibility collapses to zero within seconds of approach, making navigation impossible and the risk of disorientation, of losing the line back to the entrance. Acute and immediate. These are not minor limitations. They are hard boundaries on what human exploration can currently access. And beyond those boundaries, the cave systems continue. The water keeps moving through them, connecting them to the ocean, cycling through passages that no human instrument has yet traveled, in a darkness that has been uninterrupted since the last ice age ended and the sea came back to fill the hollow bones of the plateau. Science is honest about this. The best scientists working in these systems are explicit about the boundaries of what has been established versus what remains open. They do not claim that the unexplored passages are empty. They claim only that the unexplored passages have not been explored. That distinction is not merely philosophical. It is the precise width of the space in which the LUSCA continues to live, not in the sense of confirmed biology, not in the sense of a verified species waiting for its Latin binomial, but in the sense of genuine, scientifically defensible uncertainty, the acknowledgement that the blue holes are sufficiently complex, sufficiently extensive, and sufficiently unexplored that the category of impossible is not one that a careful researcher would apply to what they might contain. The LUSCA is not proven by science, but science, in its most rigorous and honest form, has declined to rule it out. And in the world of the blue holes, where blind creatures build lives in absolute darkness, where the bones of extinct animals rest perfectly preserved in ancient anoxic water, where cave systems extend into unmapped distances beneath an island that looks, from the surface, entirely ordinary, that declination carries considerable weight. The dark keeps its own counsel, and it has not finished speaking yet. What the LUSCA means, the final word. We have come a long way together through these waters. We have descended through the history of a people and their sea. We have mapped, as best as maps allow, the blue holes themselves, those ancient, breathing, incompletely known shafts into the hollow earth. We have traced the LUSCA's origins through the layered deposits of Taino cosmology, African spiritual tradition, and the particular psychological pressure that living beside genuinely dangerous water places on the human mind over generations. We have listened to the reluctant witnesses, the careful divers, the fishermen who do not want to be a story. We have examined what science has found in those depths, and we have sat with what science has honestly, rigorously admitted it has not. Now we surface, and we ask the question that all of this has been building toward: not, is the LUSCA real? Because that question, though natural, is ultimately the least interesting one available to us. We ask instead, what does it mean? What does a creature like this, born of this particular confluence of geography and culture and human psychology, tell us about ourselves? About the ocean, about the relationship between the two that human beings have been negotiating imperfectly and beautifully. Since the first of us stood at the water's edge and looked out, the answer, as with everything worth understanding, is more than one thing at once. The LUSCA is, first and most simply, a survival tool. This is not a diminishment. A survival tool, properly understood, is one of the most sophisticated products a culture can generate. The islanders of the Bahamas who codified the LUSCA into their oral tradition and passed it carefully from generation to generation were not engaged in entertainment, though the creature entertains. They were engaged in the transmission of critical information across time, in the only format reliably available to them. The blue holes are dangerous. The tidal pull is real. The disappearances have happened and will happen again. Children must be kept away from the edges. Fishermen must know which waters to respect and which to abandon. Divers must understand that what pulls in the cave systems is not simply current. All of this information could be conveyed as fact, as a list of hazards, a set of protocols, a map of dangerous locations. But facts, in isolation, are brittle. They fade. They are forgotten between generations, condensed into footnotes, stripped of the emotional weight that makes behavior change. A creature, on the other hand, is memorable, visceral. The LUSCA lives in the mind with a tenacity that a hydrological warning cannot match. Tell a child that the blue holes have dangerous tidal suction, and you have informed them. Tell a child that the LUSCA waits in the blue holes and is always hungry, and you have changed the way they will think about those waters for the rest of their life. The legend is the safety system. It is the fire alarm that never stops working, because it is built into the imagination rather than the wall. Every maritime culture on Earth has constructed some version of this system. The sirens of Greek mythology were not invented by people who had never watched the sea take sailors. They were invented by people who had watched it happen too many times and needed a way to make the warning last. The Kraken, the Taniwar, the Leviathan of Scripture. Each one a different culture's answer to the same challenge. How do you make the next generation respect something that has no interest in being respected, that will not announce its intentions, that operates entirely outside the framework of negotiation and appeal? You give it a face, you give it arms, you give it hunger, and you make sure the story is good enough that no one forgets it. But the LUSCA is more than a warning system, because the people who created and sustained it were more than a community managing hazards. They were human beings doing what human beings have always done at the boundary of the known, reaching for meaning, trying to understand their place in a world that vastly exceeds their ability to comprehend it. The LUSCA, in this deeper sense, is a philosophical proposition. It is the Caribbean's answer to a question that every culture eventually confronts when it lives close enough to the ocean to understand, viscerally, and not just intellectually, how much of the world is water, and how little of that water has been truly known. The question is simply this: what does it mean to share a world with something you cannot see? Because this is the actual condition of human existence on this planet, and it always has been. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. The average depth of that ocean is more than 2 miles. The deepest point descends nearly 7 miles below the surface. The total volume of the deep ocean, below 200 meters, below the reach of sunlight, below the photic zone where photosynthesis is possible, is immeasurable in any terms that feel real rather than merely numerical. And that volume is, to a degree that would surprise most people, biologically inhabited. The deep ocean is not empty. It is full of life that we have not categorized, have not described, have not even observed. New species are discovered in the deep ocean with a regularity that should be astonishing, but has become, through repetition, almost mundane. Almost, not quite. Because every new species from the deep ocean, every fanged, luminescent, improbably adapted creature pulled from below the photic zone, is a small confirmation of something the LUSCA understood all along, that the dark is not vacant. That absence of observation is not evidence of absence, that the ocean keeps secrets with a proficiency that should, if we are paying attention, inspire in us a permanent and comfortable humility about the boundaries of what we know. The LUSCA is the embodiment of that humility. It lives in the place where knowledge stops. It is the creature-shaped form of every unanswered question about the deep. Not a placeholder waiting to be replaced by better data, but a genuine acknowledgement that better data has limits of its own, and that beyond those limits something exists, whether we name it or not. There is something else the LUSCA offers. And it is perhaps the most unexpected of its gifts. It offers permission to find the ocean beautiful without pretending it is safe. This is rarer than it sounds. The modern relationship with the natural world is afflicted by a tendency toward either fear or sentimentality, toward treating wild places as threats to be managed or as backdrops for recreation, without fully inhabiting the more complex emotional register that lies between those poles. The Caribbean Sea, in the tourism imagination, is turquoise and warm and accommodating. It is the postcard, the resort beach, the snorkeling excursion that ends with rum punch at sunset. This is not false. The Caribbean is genuinely, heartbreakingly beautiful in the ways that postcards record. But it is incomplete. It omits the blue holes. It omits the pull. It omits the generations of people who have loved this sea with full knowledge of what it is capable of, who have built their lives and their cultures in intimate relation to it, without ever making the mistake of believing that their intimacy domesticated it. The LUSCA holds open that fuller relationship. It insists that the beauty and the danger are not opposites to be separated, that the turquoise and the darkness below it are part of the same water, that the sea you swim in and the sea the LUSCA inhabits are not different seas, but different depths of the same one. To love the Caribbean fully, in the way its own people have always loved it, is to love it with the LUSCA included, to stand at the edge of a blue hole and feel both the pull toward it and the instinct to step back, to let both of those things be true simultaneously without resolving the tension in either direction, is to experience the ocean honestly. That honesty is what the legend protects, finally, not just the lives of people who might wander too close to a tidal blue hole, but the fullness of the relationship, the refusal to flatten the sea into something merely picturesque, the insistence that what is below the surface is real, is significant, is worthy of both awe and caution, regardless of whether it has tentacles. The water above the blue hole is calm this evening. It is the color of fading sky, that transition hour when turquoise deepens toward indigo and the surface of the sea becomes a mirror for a world that is leaving the light. The blue hole is invisible from here. You would not know it was there if you did not already know. The ocean gives nothing away about what it holds. It never has. It is, in this way, entirely consistent, entirely itself, somewhere below, in the dark of the cave system, through passages that have not been mapped and chambers that have not been visited, the water moves. Cold, slow, mineral tasting, ancient in a way that the word ancient only approximates. It has been moving this way for thousands of years. It moved this way before the first canoe crossed these waters. It will move this way long after the last question about the LUSCA has been asked and set aside unanswered. The LUSCA, whatever it is, ecological warning, cultural memory, philosophical proposition, or simply an honest acknowledgement that the dark is populated, has outlasted every attempt to resolve it. It has survived European colonization and the destruction of the cultures that first named it. It has survived the arrival of marine biology, of cave diving technology, of satellite mapping and sediment, coring and water chemistry analysis. It has survived, most impressively, the modern appetite for definitive answers, that relentless contemporary hunger for the mystery to end. It endures because the blue holes endure, because the unexplored passages endure, because the ocean itself endures, vast and patient and absolutely indifferent to the human need to have finished understanding it. There are things in the water, there always have been. Sleep well.